movement, should be audio. So we're not starting yet. I know, like, I've got people in different things. If you're just coming in, you have specific questions. The chat window, for whatever reason, won't stay up while other windows are up. So the web campus chat, well, I'll check it every so often. I am doing like YouTube and WebEx at the same time. I have my laptop and then I got WebEx to work here. So as we add in, just sort of jump in. The only problem is if you have a question when I screen share, I can't see the chat window. So just feel free to speak to me. It might lead to a bunch of feedback loops, but as we're testing this through, we might ditch a few things. The whole point of the WebEx, right, is for you to be able to talk to me. So, like, a voice talk to me, whereas the YouTube is sort of comments and chat, and the chat window's there. But if you don't feel comfortable, right, you can always chat in. I'm checking all of these periodically. So just whatever feels comfortable for you. We're not starting yet, so I'm waiting to see how many people come in before we're getting in. Okay, so if there's a person watching on YouTube, can you please comment if you can hear me? I have a really weird audio setup, so I'm just hoping that you can hear me. We're not really starting. I know watching these lectures, like if you're watching this later, sort of talking to people in the future, this first part is very frustrating. But, okay, perfect. So, whatever's most convenient for you, WebEx obviously is an option. It's working. I have students in there. I have students in YouTube. I have students in the classroom. So I've got 3 different audiences. If I'm not looking directly at that camera, there's different cameras, there's different audiences. So as people come in, or if you're watching this sort of as a recording on YouTube, as it uploads, whatever, right, those are all options. I want to wait a few minutes to see if we get a little more of an audience. I think 13 out of 26 was still quite low, but why is this being problematic? Okay, there we go. This whole setup is a mess. I think I've got like 6 now. Okay. You should be able to see me and hear me. All right, so I'm going to start. We don't have a full house, but I believe the class starts at 8:25. I could be wrong. I'm probably wrong about that, right? Is it 8:25 start? Okay. Okay. So for those of you that are here, I appreciate it. I'm glad you're here. If you come into the WebEx or you want to chat, I think if you just talk into your mic, you just turn your mic on and talk. If you turn your camera on, I think you're allowed to be seen, but I don't know. So I don't know if you can, like, if face-to-face, that might be a little more difficult, but you should be able to talk to me. If you're on YouTube, you can chat, or you can go over to WebEx, or you can go into the chat for the web campus. I try to make this as accessible as possible for any way you can do that. Now, there are a couple things that I want to get into. Hold on, let me screen share so we know. The files, the PowerPoints I'm going over are downloadable, so if you want to download them and sort of go on your own pace, go through the slides. If I'm not keeping up or something, that's also an option. Or if you're like, what was he talking about? He's talking about something from a previous slide. You know, you can always pause me and go back. Sorry. This is not it. Okay, 1 second. Let's just do a my screen share. That's just gonna have to work. Okay. So this is where I believe we left off. For both of you, there is going to be a quiz. I just delayed it because I want to talk to you guys for a minute. It's going to show up later. I know we're delayed on quizzes, but I think we're going to end up being delayed on the exam, and I want to give you time to digest some of the material. So you will see it's going to be due next week. It's still going to be due next week, but it's going to open up tonight. You should see it open up. There were some questions that I think just weren't fair. I have a colleague that I always try to check in with about some of the material, and one of the things about the quiz that was problematic was that the questions I was asking were probably excessive for a 200 level course. I was asking sort of very high level quantitative, qualitative questions that weren't really appropriate. This quiz is going to be an essay instead of a multiple choice. I want to get used to both of those. So I'm going to present a scenario, and you're going to make an argument, what type of research design, sort of give all the answers that you can. That way I can give you a lot of feedback before the quiz, because the quiz is going to have an essay element. So thank you for the question. I hope I answered it. You will see a quiz. It's just going to be a little different. It's going to be essay form. I want you to adjust to it. Okay. I really hate this. There we go. Okay, so while I'm sharing, I can't see your questions for some reason. Oh, hold on. There we go. Okay, now I can see everything. Does that work for you in the classroom? Does it work for you? You can see? Okay. All right, so I can see the chat. You can see me. We're going to go into, I hope Vienna, I hope I answered your question. There will be a quiz. It's going to be essay. We've got more people in now, and we did delay starting the game, but that shouldn't be a problem. So for those of you recording, it's always going to be like this, just find the beginning. We left off on methodology. I believe this is the debate we left off of. I'm going to go back one slide. Oh no, this is bad. Okay, so we talked about these questions about what we're covering, right? Like these large questions about like what is the world, how do we define it, how do we determine these cases, these qualitative aspects that deal with ontology. And ontology is how the world is being built. And we're going to see this come up a lot in comparative politics. How are we perceiving the world? And there's two terms that came up this week that we're going to talk about a lot, but I want you to start getting used to saying them. And one is positivism or positivistic research. And that's the world's real, and we can look at it and measure it, and we can test mechanisms. We can see if they're working. And the other one's called postmodernism, or interpretivist or contextualist. And this question becomes one of, can we see the world, or are we interpreting the world? And for those of you who are political scientists, the best example I can give you is there's a book, Plato's Republic. If you are a political scientist, you will have to read it at some point. And Plato describes it, well, Aristotle describes it, but Plato's writing as if he's Aristotle, is if you're in a room and you're sort of chained to a wall, and you can only look at the shadows, your whole life, right? You can't turn your head, you can't move, you can only see the shadows on the wall. And so for your whole life, you see the world as two-dimensional, just shadows on the wall. And then at some point, you're released from your shackles, right? And you go out into the real world, and it's three-dimensional, and it has color and movement and all these things that your two-dimensional world didn't have. And so after you've been out in the world, you go back into your world, and you start talking to the other people in your world about a three-dimensional world. You start explaining to them, it's not just a shadow, it's not just a figure. Things have depth and color, and what we think is a flat surface, what we think is the world as a flat surface is really this large three-dimensional world. And the problem with this isn't just that you would sound crazy to those people, right? Your perception is so different that it sounds crazy to people. It's that you couldn't justify to them right, how the world works. They couldn't accept that reality, right? In both the reality, in both, right, Plato is not sort of, he's using analogies or metaphors, but his point is if your whole world, you only perceive things one way, and then you go and get a new perception, not only do you have trouble accepting that new perception, but you can't explain that new perception to the other people that you go back to. You can't say, no, the world doesn't really work that way. Because they've never witnessed it, they reject it out of hand. And so we can't say, oh, there's a real world that we all can see and observe and test, because what happens when our perception of the real world doesn't align with someone else's perception, and they're just so incompatible that they can't be real. If the world is two-dimensional, it cannot be three-dimensional. And if it's three-dimensional, it cannot be two-dimensional, right? And that's sort of the political science. If you've never heard of Plato's Republic, don't worry about it. It is a great book, but only for those of us that really sort of get into that weird stuff. And political science is a weird field. The other part, one second. The other part that we talk about when we're talking about building this world as sort of perception is this idea of what does someone mean, or what do they do, right? For those of you who are sort of, you're a different generation now, what is a little more common is this idea of microaggressions, right? Microaggressions can be perceived very differently by different people. And so therefore identifying microaggressions can be very difficult, right? Is calling someone a dead name, right? A name that they used to have that is no longer the name. Is that a microaggression, right? Is it an innocent mistake, right? What are the words? I'm not saying they are. I don't actually have any sort of perspective on this. But my point is how do we tell those microaggressions? When, for a long time, my partner was a radical feminist, right? For 10 years. And one of the things is if I held a door open for her, she would be offended, right? Because she can open her own door, right? It's not masculine or chivalrous, right? It's rude because it's treating her as if she has lesser ability, right? That's a microaggression from her perception, right? So that's one of those things we talk about. If you don't see the world the same way, then how can we look at the world and test those mechanisms? And if we can't, then the world is socially constructed. And this word socially constructed is going to come up a lot, right? We talk about this, there's this big debate, right? Science has always said this difference between sex and gender, right? That sex is this biological thing, right? That X and Y chromosomes and, right, different genetics, different biology, and then gender is this social construct, right? It's an identity, right? And we'll talk about this a lot, right? That when you have these social constructs, they still have meaning even if they're just decided upon by society. So we'll come back to this a lot. I know it can get kind of controversial, but strangely less controversial today than it was before. It might be a generational shift, and probably most of you are used to this debate now, or used to this discussion about sort of social construct or sex and gender, and bringing you into that world of what is perception, what is reality, how do we define those things. So let's move on to the next slide. This is not going to work the way it's set up. And this idea of methodology. So if we can't agree on right how the world is built, then how are we supposed to agree on the methodology to approach it? Right? I talked to you about this last week. Right? Your world is your ontology. That's how you build it. It determines your epistemology, how you understand and know that world, and then that determines your methodology. So if we start with two different worlds, if two researchers, if one researcher says there's an objective reality and we can test things, and another says no, everything is socially constructed, the methodology is going to be a longer debate, right? It's going to be a harder debate to have. And I know, like, this is real heavy science, and we're going to sort of dive into this. The point is, the harder we work now, just as a word of sort of being more cheerleader for a moment, the better you understand this part, the rest is going to be very easy. Right? When we talk about regimes and democracies and right identity, we're going to have all of this science down, and we're going to be speaking the same language, and the rest of the semester will be. So this first part's going to be really hard if you're not used to this, but I promise we'll go over it enough. So when we're talking about methodology, this is from we're still on the article, the debate article by Monk and Snyder, right, about how we're debating. And so one of the things that came up is this mixed method approach. And this has sort of become this sort of gold standard, this weird gold standard. And the way a mixed method approach is you do both. You take a qualitative case study. You understand the identity and the culture, right? You ask people questions. How do they identify? How do they believe? How do they perceive themselves in the world around them? And then you also take a regression. You take statistical analysis, you codify things into numbers, and you run them to a regression. And the point is if you've done your job really well, your case study and your process tracing and all these qualitative aspects that you're doing are going to give you this really sound logical argument about how you should expect things to behave. And then you say, I expect, say, as education level goes up, the number of children being born should go down, right? We expect that. As people, as females, right, those capable of birthing a live child, and I know it's going to get a complex in sort of our society, but those who are capable of birthing a live child, as they gain more education, we also see them gain more employment. And we see them, because they have more education and employment, have more access to birth control, have more decisions about when to give birth, and more decisions about whether or not to be in a marriage or some other partnership. And so what we see is as they get educated, it leads to all these other things about them having less children. And so, okay, that logically makes sense, right? That logically, that if they're educated, they have more opportunities, and they have more choice, they can choose how many children they have. And it's no coincidence, right? Having a child is painful. Having a child creates all these health issues, and it creates all these economic issues for the mother, right? Specifically, the person who's raising that child, right? So they might decide to have less children. So that's a logical argument. So now let's take this. Let's go to the World Bank. It has this great data set, this WB data set. And let's look at the education level, and let's look at the number of children. And sure enough, in almost all places where education increases, we see a decrease in the number of children being born, right? More educated females means less children being born. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Irrelevant, right? We have a logical argument in the qualitative case study. We can look at South Sudan, we can look at Sub-Saharan Africa, right? We can look at North Africa and Tunisia and Libya. We can look at European continents, right? Especially the Nordic countries, right? Very, very low childbirth rates and very, very high education rates, right? So we see this over and over again in the cases. So now let's run the numbers. We run the numbers, we made the qualitative, they come together. This is where we get this top-tier journal articles. They do both. They say, look at the world, it's behaving this way, we can show it in the numbers, and we can explain it logically. And that gives it the best argument. So we see, like, okay, we had that argument for the cases, and we made that. So how did we get to that point? Why did I know that, right? I know that, right, social science has really sort of coalesced on this. It's not really up for debate anymore, right? As you increase education, the number of children go down. For whatever reason, right, there are other factors, right? If you were part of a society where two groups are competing, right, they tend to have more children, right? We see in Lebanon that Arabs, right, and Muslims, they have more children. Why? Because they have a census where they take the population, and whichever group has more population, has more people, gets to be in charge of the executive branch of Lebanon, right? So they want to populate more than their counterpart, I'm going to get this very wrong. I'm very bad at religion, so I apologize. Right? I want to say Mennonite. It's not Mennonites. The Christians, the sect of Christians, right, that currently have the presidency, they had more people when the government was first formed in Lebanon. Well, now they might have less, right? So because they want to have more children. So there are other factors that compete, but we made a good argument. So now we find a case, right? That's a good point. Lebanon's a case where we see, okay, well, we found that not to hold for Lebanon. What was the case? And this is where we get theory generation through methodology. We start looking at cases, and we start seeing things that behave differently or that don't follow the logic, and then we start finding these things. And sometimes it's deductive reasoning. Okay, why is this not happening? Let's try and figure it out logically through induction, right? I've seen these things. I'm going to follow the logic, right? It's different. Lebanon is different. Why might it be different? Because it has a different form of government called consocialism. Right? This is where you have two factions and they sort of share power based on their ethnicity or religion or some factor, or nationality or whatever it is. So I have this not in text saying, I want you to think about this and I want to make a logical argument. So when you get this quiz, it's going to ask you to go above and beyond, not just memorize the material, not just know the material, but make arguments based on the material. Right? That's going to be something that you're going to be asked to do, which is a little more difficult. So in the article that we're talking about, they found that while there's this concern about quantitative results, and you'll hear this a lot in political science, there's this concern that if you don't have numbers, you're not going to get published. And it's actually quite true, right? That now that we have big data sort of runs everything, all fields, right? And no matter what social science you're in, everyone's like, well, where's your data, right? And one of the things comparative politics will argue, right, this 2007 article says, no, look, in the journals that matter, the journals we use, we still do a lot of qualitative research, right? Still qualitative empirical research. And what you find later, right, there's another article by Mahoney, right, he says, no, in these comparative politics journals, we're still in qualitative, but in the big journals, one of the biggest journals in the world, right, for political science is the American Journal of Political Science, AJPS. There's almost no qualitative research. It's all data-driven quantitative research. So really imagine what we're talking about. When we ignore these qualitative aspects, people say, well, you can run the numbers. Well, how did you get those numbers? Are you missing things? This is a very important debate to have for that aspect. Okay. I really hate how this is set up, so if you'll just give me a minute, and I should be able to get... Okay. Okay, so the next part they talk about is area studies. Well, if we're going to say that these comparative aspects matter, that culture matters, that religion matters, then there might be something about saying certain religions have certain factors. And the area studies can be geographic. You'll hear me say sub-Saharan Africa a lot. One of the reasons I say sub-Saharan Africa is because there's just a divide, right? If you're in North Africa, we're talking about Algiers and Tunisia and Libya and Egypt. These are predominantly Muslim countries. These are countries that do not have the same identity, right? They consider themselves, often consider themselves Arab or Aryan, right? Iranians are Aryan, so a weird historical fact is when Nazi Germany said the Aryan race is the best race, right? They were actually talking about Iranians, right? From Iran. And so they were like, yeah, that's a great idea. And then immediately, right, the Nazi Germany was like, no, we don't mean you. We mean blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white people, which is not any race that is Aryan, right? This is not a connection, right? But what we see is, right, the Middle East and North Africa share a lot of identity. This Arab identity or this Aryan identity or a Muslim identity, right? There's all these identities that overlap. And in sub-Saharan Africa, you don't see as many Muslims. It's not predominantly Muslim. There's still a lot, right? Because obviously there's geographic overlap. But you see different issues, right? There's a lot of states that are landlocked, right? That just don't have any ports, that don't have any access to the oceans, right? And as we find out until about the 20th century, that was incredibly important. You needed access to water because that was the easiest way to ship goods. Most of the research is still going to be about Western Europe. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? We've talked about these already, right? English is the language. So it's easier to do research in Western Europe, right? When you speak the language of the journals and of the people, it's easier to do Western Europe. The other thing is Western Europe is more documented, right? There's a great deal of documentation. One other thing about Western culture that is not as common in a lot of the other parts of the world is bureaucracy being so heavily run through documentation, right? An effective bureaucracy documents everything. And what we see is in Western Europe, before Sub-Saharan Africa, before the Middle East and North Africa, China's its own case because China sort of has a bureaucracy before most of the Western countries exist, right? 4,000 years ago, right, they started this sort of dynasty, bureaucratic dynasty, and all of these tests and uniformity, right? So they have amazing documentation, but they have thousands of years head start. So we sort of exclude China for that reason. So if we look at other areas, typically they don't have that, and so there's not as much documentation. So we see more publications. And I don't mean there's more documentation of life. I mean there's more documentation of how the government worked. Lifestyle documentation until about the 20th century was all done for personal journals, right? That people wrote down everything they did all day. Until, like, older people like to say, oh, millennials or young people or whatever the terminology that they use today, they share everything today. Well, so did people from previous times. They just wrote it all in their journal. They just couldn't share it because they didn't have the technology. but they wrote about every daily life thing that happened to them, because that was a normal behavior until the beginning of the 20th century. And then you had the radio, and then you had sort of television, and then you had less recording. There was a short time period where people didn't record their daily events as much, but then it was replaced by social media. So a lot of these factors are people just don't have a long enough perspective on history. So we're talking about these areas that have specific cases. And I know I got a little bit of a tangent, I apologize. The next part is a structural functional approach. So I want to build these categories to be useful, right? Categories have to be useful. And one of the things about them being useful is that if they have a certain structure, we expect them to behave a certain way, right? If the documentation is heavy, we expect rule of law to be better, because there's documentation of everything. If you have a landlocked nation, you expect that trade routes become very important, because you need those trade routes, international trade routes, to get your goods out of the country if you're landlocked. If you're from Lebanon, or you're from the Netherlands, right, and you have to share power with another identity, right, you have to find ways to do that. You have to find ways to bridge those gaps, right? Now, I use Lebanon more because, right, it's a little more, I have discussed this more, but the Netherlands is actually a better example. You have sort of French-speaking, what we call the Dutch people, right? You have very different groups. You have the Flemish. You have these groups that have different nationalities, different ethnicities, different languages, and they all exist in one nation, or one state, one country. And because of that, we expect them to behave different because their structure is different. They have multiple identities in one state. Now, I know this is going to be a debatable thing, but one of the things we talk about is the United States actually has a shared identity. We have shared values. We usually just refer to them as the Bill of Rights, right? We believe that the Bill of Rights applies to all Americans. And because we believe it applies to all Americans, that becomes a part of our shared identity, and it is structural functional. We believe rule of law works a very specific way, and therefore our culture and our behavior follow those procedural rules. Now, we've had some breakdowns in the last few years. Right, everything's kind of crazy right now, but what we should see as the vaccinations come through, when we go back to daily life, we're going to get very used to going back to the behaviors we had before. Do police have the right to search and seizure, right? That's a Fourth Amendment issue, right? Do you have a right to free speech? These are all cultural values and identities that we share as Americans. And most countries, most states, have a shared identity, right? And so when you don't have a shared identity, it's going to create a different functional behavior. Now, I've already talked about different areas. I've already talked about structural, functional. The last part is this idea of the developing world. Now, a lot of your texts are going to talk about third worlds. And one of the things I want you to sort of remember that we will discuss is the term third world is very inaccurate. Don't use the term third world. Even though people use it all the time, think the historical reason we have the third world is because we called the first world the Allies. This is actually a Cold War relic. So all of the countries that were allies of the United States were the first world. All of the countries and states that were allies of the Soviet Union, the communist Russians, right? They were the second world. And anyone not in those two groups were in this middle group called the third world. Now what happened is all of those countries were independent. Egypt was independent, right? A lot of the sub-Saharan African countries were independent. They just weren't involved in the Cold War because they weren't large enough economies, they weren't trade routes, they weren't relevant to the two superpowers. And so they had this independence. But because they were ignored, and because they weren't involved in the biggest arm race in world history, right, they didn't develop economically. They just didn't because they weren't getting involved with the United States, right, or the Soviet Union. And so we called them the third world. But being a third world state does not mean you're not developed. It just means that you weren't part of the Cold War, that you didn't take sides in the Cold War. So this term third world is inaccurate. Instead, we talk about developing states. And what does that really mean? It doesn't mean that they're poor. So this is part of the thing, is that we would consider Saudi Arabia a developing state. It doesn't have wealth, right? It has resources that it sells, but there's no infrastructure, there's no system to provide employment, right? It is not developed in the way that an economy, a manufacturing economy, an advanced economy, a service economy is developed, right? It is not a developed economic system, and it's not a developed political system. There aren't parties competing for office. There aren't free and fair elections, right? Saudi Arabia is sort of a bad example because you don't get to be, even if you're born there, you don't get to be a citizen, and the Saud family runs the country, right? So there aren't really elections. But until a state has economic systems in place and has political systems in place, it can't be considered developed. And so that's what we mean by the developing world, right? And we don't say underdeveloped anymore or non-developed, we say developing because they're all on their way to some goal, but if the goal used to be here, right, this is the United States in 1910 developed, right, now developed, right, what it means to be developed keeps going up as the United States goes up. And so the bar they have to hit keeps rising. And it's harder and harder to catch up. So they're developing, they're just not catching up. And there's this whole literature on dependency theory and sort of developing and being stuck in this development trap or this dependency trap we're going to talk about later. So when this happens, it creates this concern for, I really hate this, okay. It creates this concern for, right, comparative politics. And they call it the economic turn. And the concern about the economic turn, we're going to talk about this a lot. And I really hope these terms are repetitive for a while because I really want you to get this part. The economic term is that we just follow these deductive methods with this quantitative data and we just say, here's the math. Here's the math of political science. And this is a concern because comparativists will argue if you just do the math, you're going to miss things. You're going to miss identity. You're going to miss religion. You're going to miss culture, right? One of the biggest concerns about Western states when they talk about democratization is they talk about how most states in Middle East and North Africa don't have a freedom of religion aspect. Right? They just don't have freedom of religion. What they miss is that that's a cultural aspect, right? We have freedom of religion because it's part of our past, right? A lot of Americans came to the United States fleeing persecution, religious persecution. That's not the case in other places. So even if a state doesn't have freedom of religion, that doesn't mean it's not a democracy. Now, it's problematic if it doesn't, right? But that's one case. So when you say, okay, let's calculate if they're a democracy, let's give them a democracy score, that can miss some cultural aspects, right? If 99% of your population is Muslim in some faction, then having this argument that you should have freedom of religion doesn't mean quite the same thing in those cases. And also, right, that Christianity has this saying about leaving to Caesar what is Caesar's and leave to God what is God's, right? That there's this division that doesn't really exist in other religions. It's just not the same categoristic, right? It's not the same category. And that's a Western value. So that's something you could miss in this economic term. Now, the specifics of the economic term we'll go over a lot. The simplest way is if you have a 1 point change in X, it will lead to a change in Y. Right? If you have a 1% increase in literacy, it will lead to an 8% increase in GDP per capita. Now, these numbers are made up. I don't expect you to memorize any numbers, right? I don't, in this class, expect you to, know the numbers for things. That's unrealistic. I mentioned, 63% and say 4. When I give you a number, it's supposed to be explanatory. Don't memorize it. You don't need to memorize the numbers, the dates, or the authors. For those of you who are political science majors, at some point you can start picking up the author names so you know the source material, just sort of in your brain. And we'll talk about that in the next aspect, the next lecture. But one of the things that we'll see is that the numbers, memorizing the numbers is less important. Know the ideas and the arguments. So when you're just doing the math, right, when you're just saying, okay, I see education increasing GDP, and GDP is gross domestic product per capita, so how much does the government make, or how much does the entire economy do in sales of goods and services per person, divided per person, right? So you take how big is the economy and you divide it by the population, that's GDP per capita. So when you're doing that, you don't deal with the big questions. And so that was a concern, right, Monk and Steiner were dealing with when they were sort of publishing this article, and they were asked to publish this article. Every so many years, right, these journals say, okay, we're going to get these big authors together, these big names in the field, and they'll deal with some of these debates. So, okay, if we are going to much quantitative work, which we're not, that was not the concern, and we will see that in the major, like the big journals, right, sort of Nature, Science, American Journal of Political Science, yes, we're dealing with more math, but in the specific comparative politics, we're still allowing a lot of qualitative work, and we're seeing big questions being dealt with, right? There's no evidence that we're not dealing with big questions. We still concern ourselves with what is power. We still concern ourselves with what is democracy. And we're going to see that's not a separate question. What a democracy is going to be up for debate. One of the things that we should expect is Freedom House and Polity 4 are two scores. Right? You have Freedom House and you have Polity 4. And these are scores, they're indexes of democracy, right? And you want to get a 7 or a 10 or whatever the highest number you can get. And the higher number you have, the better of a democracy definition you fit for those indexes. What we will likely see this year is that most people will say our democracy score should go down. Right? We specifically had violence after an election. People didn't want to accept the election results. We had violence against government officials. Right? We had a plot to kidnap a governor. Right? We had the taking of the Capitol. Right? We are less of a democracy today than we were last year. Right? We have become a lesser democracy because we don't accept election results. We don't, right, accept elected officials. And I don't mean legally, you can always legally challenge, but we have groups of people not accepting those results. And that's not a normative statement, right? That is, we should expect, because the evidence supports, that our democracy score will go down this year. And this might just be a little blip and it goes back up, right? But we are less of a strong democracy today than we were a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 10 years ago, right? Our democracy is getting weaker. And if we want to make a better democracy, we would have to move in a different direction. And that's not a normative statement. It's just we should be able to see the news and see how it impacts. And we'll see the same thing in a lot of other countries. Their leaders will not accept the results of the election, right? And they will say that shouldn't happen. Now, the reason why I'm so concerned here, right, is because in other countries, you have people storm, and then the sort of democracy breaks down, and the military steps in and sort of supports the leader. We knew that was going to happen in the United States. We have a different culture with our military. So obviously, this means that we have to take methods seriously, right? That if the methods are this big of an aspect, and that culture matters this much, then we have to be able to recognize this, right? Now, one of the things that is very clear, that should be very clear, is that methods are a means, right? You can't say, I found this correlation, and therefore these two variables are connected in some way. You have to explain it through the theory and the logic that you've presented before you run sort of methods, quantitative methods. So, we have to consider that. The next part that Monk and Snyder sort of continued on from last week is that when we're talking about comparative politics, and we're talking about qualitative measures, and we're talking about theory generation, we have this problem. Now, when we look at a theory, we take evidence, we take cases like Lebanon, right? We say Lebanon and the Netherlands explain we have two different identities, you will have power share. They'll share power in government. And then we look at Lebanon and the Netherlands, and we say, look, these two countries that share power, right, and have different identities exist, right? Now there's the problem, right? You're seeing the problem. I'm using them to make an argument, and then I'm using them to prove my argument. Now that's a problem because there needs to be distinct. If I say, oh, apples are red because this apple's red, and then I say, look, apples are red because this apple's red, you see the redundancy there, right? And so what we need to do is we need to separate the theory generation part from the empirical analysis. And that's really hard because there are only two cases, right? Now there are only two cases of power sharing, and power sharing can be defined in a number of different ways. But when we're talking about comparative politics, there are only so many states, there are only so many things to look at. And so trying to find cases that generate the theory and the new cases that deal with empirical analysis is very hard. And when we talk about Stockpole and Geddes, we'll see why it's so hard. Right? Stockpole takes all of these countries, and she explains these countries, and she said they had these factors, and then it led to social revolution. And then she says, then these factors must require social revolution, right? That here's the proof and here's the theory generation all in one in these same cases. And then Barbara Geddes comes in and she has a book called Sandcastles, or the cases you pick, right, determine the answer you get, right? So Barbara Geddes comes in with her book and she says, no, if I just go, instead of looking at Western Europe, and instead of, I follow your rules and I follow your logic, when instead of Western Europe, I look at Latin America or South America, I get different results, right? You are using the cases, Gospel is using the cases to generate the theory and for the empirical analysis. Geddes is accepting the theory, but then using different cases for the empirical analysis and saying, there's something wrong here. You're having a problem with your case selection. And this becomes this idea of contamination, right? If you're using the same cases for your theory and your testing, then if there's something wrong with your theory, it'll still show to be true because it's going to exist. The same faults are going to be in your testing. And so that's very problematic. And we're going to deal with this a lot, right? You want to find some way to say, okay, here's my theory from these cases, and then I found similar cases that still hold up and still have enough of the same qualities that they can test the theory I've generated. And that's when we get into generalizability, which we'll talk about in the next hour. Okay. The other part about qualitative data is it's harder, really harder. When you need to know about a case, right? I'm not an expert in Lebanon. I have a colleague named Jonathan. He is a fantastic worker. He's much more qualified at everything than I am. He's Lebanese. He grew up in Lebanon, right? He speaks the language, he knows the culture, he lived it for years, right? Dr. Kamadanpour, who is on faculty here at UNLV, lived in Iran for decades. Lived in Iran during the Iranian Revolution. Dr. Kamadanpour is the person you should speak to if he has time, right? To speak to about Iran and how Iran transitioned, right, from rule by the Shah to rule by Khomeini, sort of religious theocracy. A theocracy is a government that is ruled by a specific religion. And there aren't that many, but Iran is a theocracy, right? They have Khomeini in charge, or Khomeini in charge, right, as the leader of the government and as the religious leader. But Dr. Kamadanpour would know way more about that than me, right? Jonathan would know way more about Lebanon, right? That we have colleagues that know way more about this. That's the issue with qualitative data. It is so difficult to get data on that, to get data in that world. And because the people who have the most information are the least likely to be sort of blended into, right, policy relevance, right? The people who grew up in Iran for decades are actually less likely, because of their foreign ties, to be involved in government. It's harder to vet them, right? So you have this issue where qualitative data is hard to get, even though it's extremely valuable, but it's, right, has that value, but it's not connected to policy decision makers, right? The more foreign contacts you have, the harder it is to get into a government job. Right? Just because can you be trusted, right? And that's just a normal vetting process. That's not some sort of xenophobic behavior. So that's part of the issue, right? So the last part is that when we use quantitative data to produce testable hypotheses, we have to make sure that it's clear that the regression is using variables and relationships we've defined, right? Now, when you have this is going to come up a lot later. When you're looking at any statistics, you need to remember that someone decided the values of all of those things. Very rarely is it just a simple count. When we say how free and fair is an election, how much election interference existed, how well was it, that's an index, but there's a lot of coding. There's a lot of individuals deciding values between vague cases, right? Because it's never the clear-cut cases we care about, it's the vaguer cases that we want to discuss. And so whenever you're looking at quantitative data, think, well, how do they produce this? How do they design this, right? One of the most obvious examples is that when we ask someone a religion, we have, a certain number of religions. And then we have 7 numbers. And those numbers respond to those religions, right? Well, because it's the most common answer in the United States, Christianity is number 1, right? Not right? The numbers are just meaningless, right? We just have to give them a number so that we can put it into an Excel sheet or into a quantitative system or a regression analysis software. It has to have a number, right? So each number refers to a specific religion. And if you were to say, okay, well, I'm going to run this in a regression, that would be incredibly wrong. Because the numbers don't mean that certain categories. Number 1 is not better, number 7 is other, so it's not better, right? None of those categories are better, right? But they are listed that way specifically, so when we're doing regression, we can use them because you need a number to run those things, right? So are they using the data appropriately? Look at it. How do they code it? Does it mean what they say they mean, right? And this is something that we'll get into later. And some of these questions you won't be able to answer this semester. I'm just sort of giving you an introduction. I want you to know this better. No matter what your major is, you will be asked to do some level of statistics understanding, right? It's sort of become the standard in a bachelor's degree. All right. Are there any questions right now as I go to the next slide? Okay. Why are you so difficult? Okay, so now we're talking about coverage and sample size. So coverage is this basket. What are the things that you're covering? How many aspects are you covering? How large is the aspect that you're covering? And that's going to be something we get into later. But when we get into the fine detail, the next part we really want to do is sample size. Monk and Snyder said, okay, we're doing pretty good compared research. We have to consider these things about methods, right? We have to consider, are we doing the right thing in methodology? Are we splitting our theory-generating cases from our empirical analysis cases, right? Is there a divide so we don't get contamination? But also, why is our sample size so small, right? 45% of the articles covered are the articles in the journals they looked at. So out of, I think, 300 and so many articles, only 55% of them had more than one country, right? They were single country, they were single case study. And it wasn't that they were looking at different times or different regions, they were just looking at one state and they were discussing that one thing. And that's in 2007, talking about one state. Now that's problematic, as we talked about, to be a sufficient scientific standard, you can't just talk about one case, you have to talk about its relationship to other cases. Now, how well do they talk about it in relation to the United States, right? Because there's always this implicit connection to the United States. Is that happening, right? Are you discussing that in a way that produces sort of results, right? So you can still be scientific if you have one case, because you're implicitly comparing the United States. When you say this country doesn't have 2 chambers in its legislative branch, well, the standard is 2 in the United States, right? A House and a Senate. But that's an implicit comparison, even if you don't mention those things, right? And what that could mean, right? Because we argue that you have to have 2 houses for an effective legislative branch. For those of you in American government, they do different things, right? We expect the House to be very passionate. We expect the House to be, right, excitable, populist, that they're always doing what the people want. And then the Senate, right, or the upper house, the upper chamber, is the slower body, it's the rational body, it takes into all the science, it goes through things by rule, right? And so that's why when you look at the difference in the behavior between the House and the Senate, right, senators are typically older, they have, right, more experience in government, they understand government better, and so they fulfill a very specific role. So you can still have a small end study be useful, but when you have a small end study, right, you only have a certain number of cases. Now this is going to create a lot of limitations. Excuse me. If I talk about Zimbabwe for a few years didn't want any imports, didn't want any products from any other country coming in. Their leader decided that they didn't want products from outside. They closed their borders to the best of their ability. Right? You can never perfectly close the border because it's very porous. It's actually very easy to cross borders, even if you have other aspects. Right? Borders are, for individuals, right? We're talking about military and other aspects, it's more difficult. But for individuals and for contraband across borders is very, very easy. Right? You have thousands of miles to cover, and people can just slip in when you're not looking. Right? And I don't mean that normatively or specific to the United States. it's almost impossible to keep certain products from coming in and out of the United States, right? It's almost impossible for any country to keep certain things from coming in and out, good or bad, right? No normative aspects to it. So Zimbabwe shuts down. They have a leader who doesn't want anything coming legally from anywhere else. A lot of the products that they were getting, a lot of the food that they were getting was coming from somewhere else, right? They weren't growing enough food to feed their population. So immediately they started having shortages of food, right? Now, if you're just looking at that one case and you're like, okay, well, let's compare that to Korea, right? How did their restriction on exports, or let's look at China, how did their restriction on exports? Let's look at the United States. Can you generalize? No, it's not a great generalization because Zimbabwe is very small. It does not have a lot of arable land. It can't produce as much food as other places, right? The United States actually has a ton of farmland. It can easily produce enough food within the United States. In fact, there is more food produced in California than almost any other country in the world, right? A ton of food. So it's not generalizable because Zimbabwe is a unique case. They have a unique leadership system where that individual can just say they don't want any imports. They have strange, sort of, I shouldn't say strange is a normal term. They have different customs and cultures, right? They are heavily influenced by certain aspects, right, that other countries are not, right? They have a leader who has more power than most leaders, right? Most democratically elected leaders. So it's not generalizable, it's problematic. What you would need, what are missed opportunities according to Monk and Snyder, is you would need to start looking at subnational aspects. And by subnational, right, you should think states within the United States, or if you're thinking about one country, think about provinces, regions within that country, right? That's subnational, right? You can think of the Nevada and then the counties in Nevada, right? That would be sub-state, right? That would be a great way to increase the number of cases, the N, in your research, right? And the easiest example is the United States. There's only one United States, but Americans can study the United States with a high N count, with a large N study, because there are 50 states. So instead of having one case, you have 50 cases. And then you can multiply by numbers of years of data. So if you look at 50 states and 30 years of data in those states, then you're going to have 1,500 cases to look at. That's a really big data set that you can use, right? It's not really big in some cases, but it's definitely a large N, right? It's a large N data set. And so some of the missed opportunities that Monk and Snyder talk about, one is this subnational aspect, the idea of splitting one case into multiple smaller cases. And what we'll see is there's this thing called first administrative districts. And so these are the districts that have power right below the nation, right? So they would be states. Like here in the United States, it would be Nevada and California and Oregon and New York. They would be the first administrative district. If you look at India, it would be provinces, right? They're sort of split differently depending on the state. But these are places that have power that we're split into. That's an easy way to get a subnational aspect and increase the number of cases that you're looking at. And then clearly temporal research. And temporal just means time. If you look at the difference in, say, voting records from 1990 to 2020, the last 30 years of voting records, you're going to see major differences by year, right? When is there a presidential election, right? Presidential election years will have more voting than non-presidential election years. When is there a party or president who cannot run for office again, right? We saw more voting in 2008 because the incumbent couldn't run, right, than in 2004, right? Obama could not run in 2008 because of term limits. So in all of those factors, if you take the temporal aspects, you're going to get a larger N data set. When you have a larger N data set, you can do more comparison. And I don't just mean with quantitative metrics, with numbers, but also qualitative metrics. There is a clear difference between 2019 and 2020. And if we were to look at the difference between 2019 and 2020, it would be very obvious to us why it was different, right? Very obvious. But your children and your children's children won't see in the data why 2020 had this huge dip in employment, or it had this huge dip, right, in social gatherings, right? That won't be something that's clear to people who didn't live in that time, right? It's very clear to us, but later it won't be clear. And to some groups who didn't as socialize, who didn't close down as much, or they weren't as impacted, right? If we look at sort of Australia and New Zealand, they didn't have the massive amounts of deaths and infection rates that we did, right? So if we look at the difference between the two in year and comparison, they're going to have very different things to explain than compared to the United States. Okay. So, when we're talking about Monkey Snyder, the first thing is, right, we have to look at the debates that really have evidence to support it. We talked about this, so I know this is a comparison over, like, we're doing week to week, and I'm sort of dragging through the last part of it, but don't worry about that. Excuse me. I'm fine, just yelling through a mask, and it's definitely taking its toll. We're not going to worry about paradigms. Comparative politics is not paradigm driven. We talk about rational choices of paradigm. If you were in an IR class, an international relations class, all we would talk about is paradigms. It would be the first month is paradigms, right? But when we're talking about comparative politics, it's not driven by one core aspect, right? Everything is welcome. It's this big umbrella, right? It's this big tent aspect that you can bring a lot of stuff in comparative politics. You can bring different theories. You can have rational choice. You can have a postmodernist perspective where everything's perception or socially constructed. It's all there, and it's all capable of explaining certain aspects of society. We still have a lot of theory generation, right? We still are generating theories about how the world works and how things are explained, and how things are socially constructed. One of the things we'll see is we know why certain things are socially constructed a certain way, right? Certain cultures really value water. Why? There's no water around them, right? That's a normal behavior, right? We see that in pop culture in Dune. We see it in sub-Saharan Africa where there's not water aspects. We see the value of water being very clear when it's not available. If you look at Nordic countries where water is very easily accessible, right, they don't have the connection to water that they have, right? If you look at very cold climates, right, and its relationship to fire versus very warm climates, right, you see different things, right? There are theory generation occurring explaining behavior, explaining brand behavior based on the world we live in, right? The United States and Western culture has these two terms, right? And I know I bring this up a lot. I'm not trying to be controversial, that's not the point. They have sex and they have gender, right? In the United States, we have, in the scientific community, there's a different term for sex and gender. They're different, right? One's biology, one's socially constructed. In a lot of places, because identity and sexuality aren't as connected as in the United States, there's only one term. Gender is sex and sex is gender. There's one term, right? Because culturally is very different, right? And that extends in part because until about the 1980s and 1990s, there was the idea that females should be feminine and women, right? That they should behave a certain way. And that was not as relevant in other cultures. Right? This idea of like not riding a horse directly on, or not behaving a certain way, or not working, right? There are a lot of cultures where not working, where women were told not to work in the formal economy, that just wasn't going to happen, right? You needed everyone working, and the formal economy, the economy where the currency wasn't as common. So all of the things really matter. Now the other part is that in comparative politics, qualitative methods still remain dominant. Even though we have a lot of statistics and a lot of numbers coming in, it's still qualitative methods. It's still explaining things, how they're constructed, the culture of the religion, and explaining them in words rather than in numbers. We see area studies is still dominant, right? It has criticisms, right? That why are you just looking at one part of the world? But as I explained, if you speak Arabic and you lived in an Arabic-speaking country for your childhood and your upbringing, you're going to have an expertise that other people don't, right? I was in the military for 5 years. I've been out for a long time, so I understand. But when I first got out, I had an understanding of how the military works, and I was military intelligence. I understood how intelligence in the Army worked better than other people because I had been living that for multiple years. So in all of those aspects, qualitative methods remain because, and area studies remain, because they have a lot of value and they're really hard to get that expertise. Now remember, we need to make sure that we have data distinct from our analysis, right? So if you say this explains the logic and this is the case we're looking at to test right? You don't want them to be the same case, you need to split them up. We need some more formal theory. We need to be very clear about what are the reasons we think that something is happening and what is the actual relationship. I think that education is increasing, right? I can look at the number of years of education females have, and that's going to cause a decrease in the number of live births. So I'm going to count the number of live births in a certain year, in a certain place, right? We want to be very explicit about what we're actually looking at. And we want to find some legitimate ways to increase our sample size. You don't want to just look at one thing. You want as many things as possible. And the easiest way that I'm going to explain for all of you to do this, because temporal becomes problematic, the more you learn about statistics, if you had time, you have to add all these other metrics and sort of breakups, and you can actually lose samples because they don't have the same number of years and missing data. But take a country and break it into parts that make sense, right? And it's not always states, right? One of the things that became most clear in the mid-20th century was that there had to be a dummy variable. There had to be a thing, a 1 and a 0, right? 0 if it's not and 1 if it is, for the South. Because the South in the United States had a different culture, a very different culture, right? And defining the South and where is the South, right? That's difficult. But if we're going to say these states are the South, they behave very differently than other counterparts, right? Georgia is blue now. It voted in Democratic senators. But it has had massive protests against mask wearing. It is not mandated in the same way that Western states have, right? They voted for Democrats. They have support for Democratic values, but they reject Democrats' argument that they should be wearing a mask. That's different than, say, California, right? That we have to account for that southern state aspect. And there are other things about southern states, right? Slavery and right, plantation aspects and sort of more rural culture and all these other aspects, right? We have to account for that, and we've created a dummy variable saying we have to treat southern states differently. And that's a really legitimate way to control for that while splitting them up. Okay. So now let's switch over to the SAGE Handbook. And we're going to do a little bit of introduction, and then I would like to take a break. I gotta just gonna trot out. I apologize. I'm very bad at this. Okay. Nope. Sorry, I just have too much stuff open. Oh no. I apologize. Just give me one more second. I know that you, those of you on WebEx can see. You can't see on YouTube. So just give me one. I can't. There we go. Okay. So actually no. I just have too much type over here. Okay. Sorry for the delay. So now let's get into the Sage Handbook, because this is all about the stuff we were talking about, just in a little more detail. Okay. So now we're talking about the Sage Handbook. This one is a little more detailed. It's a little more accessible. The reason I'm going back and forth is I want different authors to come at this from different directions. But what you'll notice is when we go into case studies, specifically case studies, we're citing the same authors, right? It's very important to notice that it's the same people talking about the same things, right? That we're talking about spatial factors again, right? This is Hawkins in 2009 as we move forward, right? This is the temporal factors, right, that we've talked about, right? We want to be able to split through time. Now, when we talked about demographics a little bit, but the other part is spatial factors, right? And spatial factors is we were just talking about in the other text, about how we're splitting things. Sometimes I'm going to say let's split into states because they have different sort of governments, right? Nevada's government here is very different than California's government, right? Is very different from New York's government, Washington's government, and all that. The other part can be geography, right? We are going to have a very different summer than other places, right? We are going to have, and we did this last year, we know this is going to happen. Nevada and Arizona are going to have a really hard time with masks, a really hard time getting people. It's going to be too hot for people to comfortably do that. If we look at more humid states, if we look at sort of Kansas and moving sort of southeast, they're going to have a different problem where their masks are going to be wet. And we know when masks are wet, especially cloth masks, that they become less effective, right? So the geography is going to matter, the climate's going to matter. We also know that in the next coming months, right, that there's a lot of agricultural workers who need to be outside, right? And so they have to be in somewhat close proximity to do their job. So we might be facing another surge. Now, hopefully the vaccinations are coming through faster than sort of these things are happening, but they're there. And then demographics. UNLV is was last year, the most diverse college in the country. We were the most, UNLV here, the most diverse, right? We were very, very diverse. And a lot of places really want diversity. Now, the university wants it for different reasons, but one, diverse students means more foreign students who actually pay more than in-state tuition, right? If you lived here and you grew up here, you pay in-state. If you're from out of state, you pay the university more, they make more money. And if you're an international student, you pay even more money. So schools make more money when they have people from different communities. They get more federal funding, right? But the part that matters to those of us in the classroom, right, is that you have better results. You have better results. Your scores go up, your grades go up when you have diverse groups in the classroom, right? That we know that. And so if I'm looking at a diverse society like Las Vegas, the behavior is going to be different. The behavior is going to be dramatically different than a very sort of monochromatic society in the South, right, where you see a very stark divide. There's not a lot of groups, right? Predominantly a majority white states with large minority, right, specifically black minorities in the South, right? You have sort of Asian minorities in sort of Western states. They behave differently, right? They behave differently. And so we have to recognize those demographics matter. We also look at wealth income. New York is very different from Washington, from sort of Seattle, Washington, because you have more income inequality in New York, right? You just happen to have a higher minimum wage rate. Seattle has a $15 minimum wage. So you have less income inequality. What does that mean for that population? And then we look at temporal factors. And I'm going to talk about temporal factors and then I'm going to need a break, so we'll come back. Let me get through this part and we'll come back to this positives and a little more review. I know this is very repetitive, but I really want you to get this stuff. One of the things about temporal factors we have to recognize is that the world today is so different than the world that we had in 1980. The technology, the education, the culture, and the values are very, very different. So in 1980, right, one is that computers weren't common. You didn't have personal computers as common as they had. And you didn't have the internet. It wasn't a thing, right? It wasn't existing. After the invention of the internet, the level of academic discourse dramatically increased, right? Scientists could talk to each other without being in the same room, which means the cost of scientific discussion went down very, very low, right? The other part is that all of you are sort of reading articles online, which means that the cost of education and of educating yourself dramatically decreases. Oh, okay. So I do have a question. Okay. Why does diversity cause people to learn better or behave differently? So this is actually really a question. Thank you for asking it. I will finish technology, but we'll answer this question. So if you get 5 people in a room, and they all have the same background and the same knowledge because they share the same ethnicity and religion and age and sex, you only have one set of knowledge, right? Partly, this is part of the reason why. And I had a question from the chat in WebEx. So if I take a group of all white males, they only know what white males know. And if they're all farmers, they only know what farmers who are white males know. They only know those aspects. And so if I ask them to discuss something like reproductive rights, which is the most insane thing that we see, right, in governments, it's typically white males discussing reproductive rights. A lot of them don't know the terminology. They don't know how it functions. And if I just take a bunch of people who don't know how the system functions, right, and they're the one making the decision, there's no way for them to know the gaps that they have. They don't even know what they don't know, right? And then I add one person. And they just happen to be female. And what's going to happen is every time that group is discussing and they say something dumb, right, which is going to happen with a group of 5 white males, right, one of the females, or if you add just one female, is that if it's safe space and they're at the table and they actually have a role, right, they can voice their opinion, they're going to say that's wrong. What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. That does not make any sense. That's inaccurate. And if they're scientists and they're willing to accept new evidence, they're going to say, what? Why is that wrong? And that person, because they've lived that life for so long and they have different knowledge, right, they're going to explain to them in very clear ways that they understand to that other group, right? If we talk about reproductive rights, certain people will have very different knowledge bases. If we talk about racial equality, certain people are going to have a very different perspective. And just by introducing that new perspective, people will have to challenge what they think they know and realize that they have less knowledge. That's part of it, right? That people are just coming with different sets of knowledge, right? In diverse terms, right? Now, obviously, in the classroom, all of you have just a different set of knowledge. But in diverse terms, you all bring that in. The next part is that when we have diversity, it increases this idea that you can challenge your beliefs, especially in a college classroom, right? We know that people who have a higher level of education are less likely to think and behave in racist manners because they have an opportunity to challenge assumptions that they have and then adjust those things, right? If you are in a very diverse school and you believe something insane, right, and you're challenged by that insanity, and you're in a school, your minds aren't in a position to learn, you're going to take that new information and say, okay, I believe something that was wrong. And you're going to gain knowledge in that process. And what we see is the more that you start learning from your peers, and the more you start collaborating because of this diversity, that when I ask you to learn something about positivism, or ontology, or I ask you to learn about anatomy or math, your brain is already ready to make new assumptions, or to change assumptions, or to set up new things. And so diversity opens you up, and those people provide you with new knowledge. And so both of those factors come into play. And I know that's a long answer, but we have so much research on this, and one of the things that's very strange is places like Harvard and Princeton, these sort of Ivy League schools, they have a diversity problem, right? Not that diversity is a problem. They don't have enough diverse students. They can't get certain students in, specifically Hispanic students. Not that Hispanic students aren't performing, it's just that they don't apply. They typically don't have the $200 to even apply before they go to that college, even if they have the qualifications, right? And so they have a problem that we don't. We have this incredibly diverse staff, and it's really helping in the education. And so I know that's a long answer, but right, it's very exciting that we're a diverse school using what it has. Yes. Why are we more diverse? Okay, so Las Vegas is diverse because no one originally lived here. There's no indigenous. I mean, it is an indigenous population, but Las Vegas is a manufactured society, and people come here from other places to get a better job, right? Sort of this immigrant story of America, right? That even within the United States, a lot of people left California or the East Coast to come to Las Vegas, right? In 1910, right, my grandfather bought property here in the 1950s, and it was dirt cheap, right? It wasn't until the mafia left in the 50s and 60s and he started introducing entertainment, right, after the sort of Rat Pack in the 60s and 70s, that you had any population growth in Las Vegas. So what you have is less than 60 years of population explosion, right? We're growing very rapidly, but it's all people coming from someone else, right? Because the women, the females who live here, the females who could give birth who live here, they're not giving birth. They're having less than 2 children. So there's no population growth through children. It's all mobility, right? And so people are coming from all over the world here and staying here because they get a good job. And we intentionally pull in different people, right? For those, a little bit of Las Vegas history. When Las Vegas casinos got up, white people didn't know how to be dealers. They had never been dealers. They had never been in that job. And so the first place that we went was Havana, to Cuba, because they already had gambling halls. And so we brought in Cubans to run the tables, right? And then as it continued to grow, there was a specific ability to go out and reach for cheap labor in the sort of Asian market, specifically sort of Macau or places like that in the Philippines, because they had all of those people with that expertise. And then when you have the solar panel infrastructure come in, well, there was no solar panel government, right, for solar power in Las Vegas. There weren't any people who knew that job. So you had to go to Southern California, you had to go to sort of Florida to get them, and you had a Hispanic population that just so happened to be having the most expertise in those fields. And so what happens is you keep reaching out and you say, oh, I need people who do solar power. Well, Hispanics overwhelmingly represent solar power right now. In the installation and the manufacturing, right? It's partly because their labor was cheaper, right, and easier to get in Southern California, right? It is an economic model that takes advantage of minorities, but Las Vegas benefits from that. It keeps pulling in these people, I need this expertise, I need this, right? Nurses from Canada, and right? All of these things that sort of come together, and then what happens is it's an incredibly diverse city because no one ever actually started here, right? Whereas if you look at sort of the UK or the Netherlands or something like that, it's incredibly white because everyone's from there, right? Whereas if you look, very few Las Vegas natives before 1980, right? In your generation, maybe more natives now, but up until 1980, there just wasn't a native population. People having children and being raised here, that wasn't a thing. And then in the 80s it comes, so it's a new society. And any new society built on economic growth is going to be very diverse because you need different people, right? Without being Hamilton, right? Immigrants get the job done, right? That's part of the aspect. So I know that's a big answer to a question about diversity. And it explains some of the demographics. But I'm really happy we're all here. I need to take a break. I appreciate you getting involved. I'm so glad we talked about diversity. It is really this thing that is going to play a huge role in comparative politics we're discussing, but also Las Vegas is this incredible example. So I'm glad that you're involved. We're going to take a break. I think I can shut these down without it being a disaster. So I'm going to start with the YouTube, just because it's easier. I'll start a new live stream. If you want to switch over to the WebEx, you want to switch over to the YouTube, right? Obviously, they're both working. So I will see you in about 15